Water. Water. Water is not just something that we want. It is something that we need, something that we desperately need. They tell us that the human body is 60% water. As you are there listening to this message, as you are there studying the Bible today, 70% of your brain is water. As you are breathing and listening to this study, they tell us almost 90% of your lungs are water. Water is not just something we want, something that we need. Each and every day we need water. And I believe that God has created human life in such a way that that desperate need for water will be a constant reminder of our desperate need for God. And because of that, God often will put His people into the desert or desert experiences to heighten, to highlight that need for water that will heighten our need for God. As you read the scriptures, you often find this. Abraham spent time in the desert. Moses spent time in the desert. David spent time in the desert. Elijah spent time in the desert. John the Baptist spent time in the desert. The Apostle Paul spent time in the desert. To heighten our need of God, God often will put His people into the desert, not only literally, but sometimes figuratively. God will put us in dry situations so that we will remember, that we will learn, that we will be reminded how desperately we need Him. And this idea that our need for water is a reflection of our need for God is one of the grand themes of Scripture. It is something that you see from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible. It is something you see from the very beginning of creation until even beyond our time and into the millennium we will see. Our need for water is a reflection of our need for God. And to show you that in our Bible study today, there are three things I want to talk to you about. If you happen to have a piece of paper, you can jot these three things down, because I want to talk to you about these three things that show this desperate thirst for God. I want to talk to you, number one, about an amazing miracle. Then, number two, I want to talk to you about an amazing memorial. And then finally, I want to talk to you, thirdly, about an amazing moment. Really, it's the amazing moment we want to get to, but you will not understand that amazing moment unless you go back and understand the amazing miracle and the amazing memorial. Then you'll understand the amazing moment. The first thing I want to talk to you about is an amazing miracle. Go back, if you will, into the second book of the Bible, Exodus chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17, because there we find an amazing miracle, one of the most amazing miracles in all of the Bible. It is the miracle of water coming out of a rock. In Exodus chapter 17, verse 1 to 6, and Verse 1, then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and they camped in Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." So Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" And the people thirsted there for water. And the people complained against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and also take in your hand the rod with which you struck the river, and go. And behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. An amazing miracle. God took his people out of the land of Egypt and into the wilderness. Listen, it was a picture of salvation. And after that salvation experience, God put his people into the middle of a wilderness, into the middle of a desert, until they got thirsty for water. And why did he do that? To remind them of their thirst for him. And this miracle, listen to me, is one of the most amazing miracles in the Bible. Not just because of where the water came from, but because of how much water came from it. An amazing miracle, water coming out of a rock. You don't think that's an amazing miracle? Go get a stick today and hit a rock and see what you can do. Absolutely incredible. But as I said, not just water coming out of a rock, how much water came out of that rock? As you continue to read the Old Testament, you'll read in the book of Numbers that Moses numbered the fighting men of Israel. They were 20 years old and above. And that number was 603,550 men. When you add the women and the children, it's around 3 million people. Now, they tell us that you and I need to drink approximately 2 to 3 quarts of water per day. Take out the calculator, do the math, and what you discover is that out of that rock was coming 1.5 million gallons of water a day. I have a word for that. Wow! Wow! And that's just water to drink. That's not water for the animals. That's not water for cooking or cleaning or bathing. God did an amazing miracle in the desert. Why? To remind his people, to remind you and me of a desperate thirst that we have for God. Because this was such an amazing miracle. Number 2, God had them do an amazing memorial so that they would never, ever forget this amazing miracle. That amazing memorial is what's called the Feast of Tabernacles. Look in your Bible at the next book of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Look in Leviticus chapter 23, because there you find a description of the amazing memorial to help them remember this amazing miracle. Called the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. As you read the Old Testament, you discover that there were many feasts and many festivals and many celebrations and all of that, but there were 3 big ones. In Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16, it said, 3 times you shall go up to Jerusalem. So important were these festivals that anywhere a Jewish man was in the land of Israel, or even in the world at that time, 3 times a year, he and his family were supposed to go up to Jerusalem. They were supposed to go up for Passover. They were supposed to go up for Pentecost, or sometimes it's called the Feast of Weeks. And they were supposed to go up for the Feast of tabernacles. It was the high point of those three important, it was the most joyous celebration of the people of God. And in Leviticus 23, we have a description of it. Verse 33, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. Every year, for 7 days, they would have to have this amazing memorial, this amazing celebration called the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. You ask a good question. Why is it called the Feast of Booths? Glad you asked the question. Go down to verse 40. And you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, and the boughs of leafy trees, and the willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. And you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths, tabernacles, these little tents, these little huts. The Jewish word is sukkah. For 7 days, verse 42 says, all who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. An amazing memorial. What would happen is every single year, once they got into the land and Jerusalem became the center of their worship, all of the Jewish men, they would take their families and they would go up to Jerusalem, and for 1 week, for 7 days, they would celebrate what's called Sukkot, which means a booth, and they would erect these booths, and they would live in these booths for 7 days. It was a national camping trip. They would camp out for a week. Even if they lived in Jerusalem, they would put up one of these little hut structures. They would go get these branches and make this frame, and then they would take these 3 kinds of leaves, palm leaves, leafy branches, and weeping willow branches, and they would put them all over this hut, and for 1 week they would live in this hut. They designed it in such a way there was a little space between the branches, so at night they could look up through the branches, they could look up at the stars, and no doubt all of their children are asking a good question. Mommy, Daddy, why are we doing this? And God says, I'm having you do this so all your generations will know, so you will never, ever, 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 ever forget how I led the children of Israel through that wilderness time. I provided for them. I was to them absolutely everything they needed. And so year after year after year, they would celebrate, and it was such a joyous celebration. They would eat special foods that would remind them of bread that came down from heaven. They would do something that involved fire and light, because you remember the pillar of fire and cloud led them through the wilderness. Don't know if you've ever, spent time out in the desert. But at nighttime, it gets really, really cold. And a pillar of fire, listen, was there to keep all of them warm. And then during the daytime, it would give off smoke. So in the blazing hot sun of the desert, that cloud would be the shade to them. So they would do something to remind themselves of that. But most importantly, they would do something that involved water to remind them. They would always remember. Their children would always know that water came out of a rock in the middle of the desert. As desperately as we needed water, so desperately we need God. They did it year after year after year after year. For 70 years, they were taken into captivity, but then they were brought back to the land, as you've been studying in the book of Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi. And you can read it in Nehemiah chapter 8. When they came back to the land, they kept the Feast of Tabernacles. I don't have time to go into it now, but definitely Pastor Brennan will go into it. In Zechariah chapter 14, verse 16, it speaks of the millennium, and it says all the nations will keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Not a message on eschatology. I'm just telling you the facts. That you and I will celebrate the feast of this amazing memorial. We'll do it 1,000 times. I have a word for that. Wow. Wow. Over and over and over, we will remember that God brought water out of the rock. As much as we need water, 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 so much we need God. But as the years would go by, because this was so important, the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, this Feast of Booths, it became more joyous and more celebrative and more festive and more elaborate, especially when a man named Herod the Great, King Herod the Great, especially when he rebuilt the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. And that brings us to the third thing I want to talk to you about. And that's an amazing moment that happened in that temple that Herod rebuilt. That amazing moment is recorded for us in John chapter 7. Everyone, please look at John chapter 7. Now you know the amazing miracle and the amazing memorial. Now look at the amazing moment. In John chapter 7, notice beginning in verse 1, after these things Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews, can somebody help me? The Jews, what? Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. Everything I've been telling you about. Down to verse 10. But when his brothers had gone up, then he also went up to the feast. Which feast? The Feast of Tabernacles. Not openly, as it were, but in secret. Then the Jews sought him at the Feast of Tabernacles, and they said, "Where is he?" And there was much complaining among the people concerning him. Some said, "He is good." Others said, "No, on the contrary, he deceives the people." However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. Verse 14. Verse 14. Look at verse 14. Now about the middle of the feast, what feast? That week-long Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus went up into the temple and taught. To understand the amazing moment we're about to see in John chapter 7, verse 37, you need to look at verse 14. And you need to fix firmly in your mind where Jesus was and what was going on when he was there. Verse 14 is clear. He went up into the temple. Now, what was that temple like? I want, as it were, to describe to you so you are transported from this place 2,000 years ago to another place. The temple, you remember, was first built by Solomon. It was destroyed by the Babylonians. But then you remember, you've been studying this, how Zerubbabel went back under the encouragement of Zechariah and Haggai and rebuilt the temple. He rebuilt the house of the Lord. Not quite as elaborate as Solomon's temple, but it was very beautiful. And time would pass between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You remember, as Daniel the prophet said, there's going to be the Babylonians, then the Medes and the Persians, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. And the Greeks and the Romans were builders, especially the Romans. And so when a man named Herod the Great became the king of the Jews in Jerusalem, he decided he wanted to make the temple the most beautiful building on the planet. He wanted a building that would rival anything the Greeks or the Romans had built. And so what he did is he upgraded and beautified the temple that Zerubbabel had built. And here's what he did. The temple, as you remember, was situated on a small hill called Mount Zion. It's called a mount, but don't be thinking Mount Baldy or something like that, okay? It's more like a hill. And what he did is he built a ginormous retaining wall around the entire hill. And then he filled it in with dirt so he could create a level platform on which he would build up the temple. It's sometimes what's called the Temple Mount. Picture in your mind a huge rectangle. Listen to me. That Temple Mount was 1,500 feet long and 900 feet wide. Think for a moment, 5 football fields long and 3 football fields was wide. I have a word for that. Wow! It's huge, massive. And the stones he used to build the retaining wall were incredibly large and heavy. If you go to the land of Israel, and I've heard word that there's going to be a trip coming up. If you go to the land of Israel, you can actually go down below that Temple Mount along the wall, and you can see some of the stones that Herod used to build up that retaining wall. Some of them, listen to me, are 40 feet long, 12 feet high, 18 feet thick, and they weigh more than 100 tons. Yeah, I have a word for that too. Wow! And they put them together in such a way you couldn't even get a knife laid in between them. No mortar, they just stacked them. Even today, people wonder, how in the world did they do that? But that was only the retaining wall and the Temple Mount. And then up on top of that, Herod built the temple proper itself. It was incredibly beautiful, built of white marble stones, in many places overlaid with gold and silver and precious stones. There were 130 columns that were 40 feet tall. The main gates that went in, listen, were made of brass. They were 13 stories tall. The veil of the temple was 60 feet high, 30 feet wide. It took 300 priests just to hang that veil. They estimate that if someone were going to try to build the temple that Herod rebuilt in our day, the cost would be more than $1 trillion. I hear word the Rams are building a stadium up here, a few $1 million. We're not talking billion. We're talking trillions of dollars. And there were all these courtyards in the temple, and you would go up through the southern steps, through the bottom of that huge rectangle, almost like you're in a tunnel, and then all of a sudden you would emerge out into this temple. And Jesus was teaching in that temple. During what? What was going on when he went up through those tunnels and onto that platform, onto that Temple Mount? What was going on? Well, the Feast of Tabernacles. The Jewish historians tell us that over the centuries they began to make the celebrations even more festive and incredible and wonderful. And hundreds of thousands, millions of people had converged on Jerusalem. Tacitus, the Roman historian, tells us that the population of Jerusalem at that time was 600,000 people. When you count, Josephus gives us the number of sacrifices. When you multiply that out, there were some 2.5 million Jews in Jerusalem then. Listen to me. And there were huts everywhere. There were huts in the front yards. There were huts on the rooftops. There were huts in the streets. There were huts all over the Temple Mount area. Jesus, he's walking through all of these huts. And he goes up and there are huts everywhere. And day after day, they're celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Huts, the Feast of Booths, and they were eating special food, and they were doing something to remember the fire and something to remember the water. Listen, what they did to remember the fire had grown so elaborate, so impressive, so beautiful. In the main temple area, in the court of the women, they erected 4 huge menorahs. You've seen those Jewish candlesticks with 7 lights across the top? They erected the 4 of them. They were facing north, south, east, and west. Everyone listen to me. They were 75 feet tall, the size of a 7.5-story building. And the wicks on the top of them were made of the worn-out garments of the priests from the year before. They would lean up these massive ladders, and these young priests would scale up the ladders, and they would light the wicks at the top of those menorahs. And at nighttime, listen, Jerusalem from afar looked like a pillar of fire. It looked like a volcano. There was so much light from those menorahs. At nighttime, you could just sit there and read a book. Every night they were doing it to remind them, the pillar of fire. You know, the Jewish day begins at night and then goes through the morning. So at nighttime, that's how it started. Every night, fire. But then every morning, water. Water. To remember the water from the rock was so beautiful. At daybreak, hundreds of thousands of people would flood into the temple area. They would go up by the temple and they would divide themselves in 3 groups. One group would go and gather huge leafy branches that they would erect in this like canopy over the altar area, because something very special was going to happen at that altar. So this is like this big canopy over the top of the altar. A second group would go with musicians, because there was a choir and musicians that would sing. But then the third and largest group, the third and most important group, would follow the high priest to get some water. The high priest, dressed in pure white, with other priests dressed in pure white, would take a pitcher of gold. He would go out the southern steps, the southeast corner of the Temple Mount, and all these people following him. He would go down this rocky path to this place called the Pool of Siloam. It was the only natural source of water that came from the spring of Gihon. It fed into the Pool of Siloam. And he would take that gold pitcher and he would dip it down into the water, and as he was dipping it in the water, all of the people would recite Isaiah 12 and verse 3. With joy shall you draw water out of the wells of salvation. And then they would go back into the city of Jerusalem, and when they went back into the city of Jerusalem, they would enter through the water gate. And the moment they went in through the water gate, there were 3 blasts of the trumpet. Boop, boop, boop. And all of a sudden, everyone would say again, with joy shall you draw water out of the wells of salvation. They would follow the priests all the way back to the temple, and while they were there, the choirs were singing, there was music playing, and every one of the worshipers that was there had this little bunch of branches in their hand. It was called a lulav. It was made of 3 different kinds of branches. Every single one of them had it. And the high priest, he would come up to where the altar was. And he would hold up that pitcher. They would all wave their branches toward the altar. Hundreds of thousands of people. He would take the water and he would pour it into this silver funnel that would drip down into a silver basin at the base of the altar. Why? Water from the rock. To remind them, water, 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 water. Every day they would do it just like that, except the last day, called the great day of the feast, it was even more elaborate. And the priest, the high priest with the priests follow him, he would not only go up to the altar, he would walk around the altar 7 times to remind them that 7 times they had marched around the walls of Jericho. Listen, it was an amazing celebration. It was an amazing memorial. But in the middle of that amazing memorial, there's an amazing moment that happened. In John 7, verse 37, look at it there. There's the amazing moment. On the last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." I want you to be there. I want you to understand. Because when you understand it, listen, you will never forget it the rest of your life. Some of you, listen, you will never read John chapter 7 again the same in your entire life. Take yourself back. You're a Jewish man 2,000 years ago at the Feast of Tabernacles. You're a Jewish wife 2,000 years ago at the Feast of Tabernacles. You're one of the Jewish children 2,000 years ago at the Feast of Tabernacles. And you have gone up to Jerusalem with hundreds of thousands, some 2.5 million people. And every night you have watched those priests go up and light those menorahs. And every morning you have gone with the priests and you went down to the pool of Siloam and you said, "With joy shall you draw water out of the well." Every day that's gone on. But now it's the last day. The celebration's almost over. And so you get up early in the morning and you go down to the temple area so excited. And you got your little lulav in your hand. You got your little branches in your hand. And here's that high priest. He's got that golden pitcher. And you follow him out those southern steps, down that rocky path, down to the pool of Siloam. And with your own mouth, you say, "With joy shall you draw water out of the wells of salvation." And you start following him back. And you go through the water gate. And as you're walking through, you hear, "Doot, doot, doot." And again you say with your mouth, "With joy shall you draw water out of the wells of salvation." And you follow the high priest and that throng back to the temple area, and you see that massive bronze altar there, and you see the branches over the top of it, and the choirs are singing, and the flutes are playing, and the priest, he's walking around once, and twice, and 3 times, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the music is at a crescendo, and you're taking your little branches and you're waving at the altar, and all of a sudden the music stops. You can hear a pin drop as the high priest takes a golden pitcher and he holds it up in the air, and everyone is watching and ready and waiting for him to pour it out. When all of a sudden, from the middle of that crowd of hundreds of thousands of people, you hear a voice. You hear the voice of Jesus. Verse 37 says, he cried out, ekrazin, he screamed out. All of a sudden, you hear this voice. "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." Wow! What an amazing moment! The timing of Jesus could not have been more perfect. What was Jesus saying? He was saying everything that water in the rock pointed to is me. Everything your people have been celebrating for all of these centuries, it's pointing to me. Not my opinion. You just read 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4. The Apostle Paul says they all drank from the same spiritual drink. They all drank from the same spiritual rock. And that rock was Christ. You just read John chapter 4 when Jesus said to the woman at the well, "You drink this water, you're going to thirst again. But if you drink of the water that I will give you, you will never thirst again." Jesus is the answer to that desperate thirst we have for God. And that is why each day and every day. You not only need to drink water, that is why, as a believer, each day and every day, you need to spend time with Jesus. If you do not drink water, you will become dehydrated. You will become incoherent in your mind, and your body will start to fail you. And if you are not spending time with Jesus in your spirit won't function right. You won't walk with God right. Emotionally and mentally and every other way, all of a sudden you're not going to be who you are supposed to be. You're not going to be able to walk with God. You're not going to be able to do the things of God because you are not in connection with the one who gives living water. Oh, a desperate thirst for God. From the beginning to the end of the Bible, beyond the rapture, beyond the tribulation, beyond the second coming, into the millennium for 1,000 times. We will remember this, that we need Jesus. We need Jesus every day, every moment. We need Jesus. The psalmist understood this. And that's why I want you to look at one last passage in the book of Psalms. It's found in Psalm 42. And verse 1. Everyone, please look at this one last passage in Psalm 42 and verse 1. The psalmist writes, "As the deer pants for the water, so my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God, as the deer pants for the water. So much I need you, God. So desperate I am for you, God. I pray that's your heart. I pray that's your longing. If that's anything short of your longing, you're not living the way God would want you to, that each day and every day you not only want to spend time with Him, you know you need to spend time with Him. So desperate are you for God. As desperate as you are for water, so desperate you are for God. We've never had a deer, but we did have a dog. His name was Rufus. Rufus, this little miniature German schnauzer, if you would say his name, Rufus, he would howl back at you. So cute he was. And I remember almost every day when I would come home from the church office, I would go take Rufus for a walk. We lived near a large regional park here in Orange County, and I would come home and I would get Rufus's leash and a tennis ball, and I would put Rufus on his leash, and I would take him over to this gigantic regional park, and there was nobody there, just me and Rufus. And so I would take Rufus off of his leash and let him have a little free time, just to wander and have fun. And as he would wander around for a while, then he would want to play with his tennis ball. And so what I would do is I'd take that tennis ball and I would throw that thing as hard as I could, and Rufus, he would take out after that tennis ball. Only I'm kind of sneaky, so when he's running after the tennis ball, I turn the opposite way and run as fast as I can the opposite way. And just about when Rufus is getting to the tennis ball and I'm at the other end of the field, all of a sudden Rufus! And he comes running back toward me with a tennis ball. And I mean, he's running so fast, he's not really running, he's kind of like hovering, you know what I mean? He's just flying toward me. And he would run up to me, he would drop the tennis ball. I mean, he's just hacking and heaving. I mean, he is so tired. He would catch his breath for a moment, and then I would grab the tennis ball. I would chuck that thing again. Out he would go. Sneaky me. I would run the opposite direction. About when he gets to the tennis ball, Rufus! And he would come running back. Oh, we would have a time running, playing. When I had thoroughly worn him out, and myself too, I would put Rufus on his leash and take him back to the house, and we would come up to the front door, and I would open the door. I would take him off of his leash, and he would immediately run right over to his water dish, and I mean, he is just inhaling water. He's lapping it up so much, so fast. And so many times, I would stand there in our kitchen looking down at my dog, and I would pray quietly, "Oh God, please help me to want you like that. Oh God, please help me to be thirsty for you like that. Oh God, make me desperate for you like that. I can't go for a day or an hour or a moment just without thinking of you, without communing with you, without praying to you." A desperate need for God. Water, you see, is not something we want. It's something we need. And that need for water should remind you and me every time you drink a sip of water.